Hi, Coffee and Convo listeners. It is your host, Liz Bullard. Thank you for tuning in again. If you're new to Coffee and Convos, it is a podcast where I talk with different residents, community leaders, business owners, and really anyone who's really great at holding an interesting conversation. And we discuss things that are happening here locally to the Waterbury community, as well as things that are going on globally. And for this episode, I am joined by community advocate Maybeth Morales as we discuss and kind of play around with the question of, are we doing justice for our children? Meaning, we've had so many things go on, whether it's um, COVID related things, racial injustice, and have we really addressed this from that educational standpoint? And I know that can be sometimes a dicey or a difficult balance between school and home. What does the school address and what does the home address? But I think that the school has a little bit of a obligation to at least check in with their students, especially when they're spending a large part of the day there. And all these factors, these global factors, affect their ability to focus, their ability to put their education first. And so I think that it's also a conversation that might come up in school, even as we are doing virtual education, or how we were doing virtual education in the spring and how we might do that in the fall. These are all questions and things that might come up. And to ignore them, I think dismisses children and dismisses their thoughts. And so um, I was very excited to have Maybeth as we talk about inclusion, removing the police from the school system. What does having a more inclusive environment for our children look like? And what I really liked was that Maybeth referred to the data. And I think that's really important when you're having these conversations, and everyone has various opinions. But looking at the data, what is the data showing as far as numbers? And so Maybeth refers to that a lot during this episode. So grab a seat, grab a snack as we decide if we're doing justice for our children, who are definitely the future of this nation. Thank you, be well, and remember to follow Coffee and Combos on Instagram and Facebook. Hi, Coffee and Combo listeners. Here's just a quick ad before we get started. So go and check out and download the free Anchor app, or go to anchor.fm if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast. With Anchor, it's completely free to use all the tools. There is no subscription required. So you can create your own podcast from start to finish using the app or website. You also get access to different tools like adding background music when you create your podcast with Anchor. Anchor distributes your podcast with just one click of a button. Your podcast will be available on Spotify, Apple, and many more sites. The bonus with Anchor compared to other podcasting sites is you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. So if you're interested in podcasting, or you have an existing podcast, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to start using the app and creating your ads and creating your podcast. So as always, thanks for listening, and please like, share, and find Coffee and Combos on Instagram and Facebook. Welcome to Coffee and Combos. How are you doing?
Oh, thank you, Liz. I'm excited to be here. How are you?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you because you are like so involved in the community. So I'm interested to get your perspective on a couple of things. But for all those of you who are listening, I am joined by my friend and community advocate, Maybeth Morales. She's very involved in Waterbury and many different things. And so I thought it was very fitting. And also is a mother and passionate about education. So I thought it was fitting to kind of talk about the children and are we doing them a disservice? You know, we have everything that's going on
as far as racial injustice, coronavirus, all these things in the air, and are we doing them a disservice? So hopefully by the end of the conversation, we get to discuss that and try and figure out, are we doing our kids, the future, a disservice?
Yeah. And my point of views are obviously my own, and but hearing your feedback and perspective and opinion as well as a resident of the city, and you yourself are a huge proponent of education in this city. So I definitely want, I think this will be a good conversation both ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's jump right in. So are you a coffee or a tea drinker?
Oh, I am a coffee drinker, Liz. I tell you this, I usually only pick up a cup of tea, actually, if I'm sick, like I have a sore throat or just feel achy. Otherwise, you'll see me with a cup of coffee, usually in the morning, to go towards a bold, strong coffee. I'm actually drinking a Puerto Rican coffee. The last about 4 or 5 months now, we've been heavy drinking on that coffee right now. It's delicious. But yes, love coffee. No sugar, just a little bit of cream.
Really? But I feel like you have like this just bigger than life bold personality. So I can see that as far as a coffee, just like a straight bold coffee.
That's me. You drink coffee or tea?
I can't get past the bitterness of coffee, so I'm a straight tea person. But I love like the whole tea experience. Like I love like green teas, black teas, and especially with the honeys. Like I'm a big honey person. Like clover honeys, wildflower honeys, local. Like I love it.
Yeah, awesome. All right, now I know. Next time we sit down for a cup of tea / Joe, we know who's drinking what.
Absolutely. So again, just wanting to talk to you about education, and what prompted this is when you had mentioned that you were talking or you were reaching out to the superintendent in regards to her response regarding racial injustice, and it wasn't like an immediate response after everything with the George Floyd and how public. There was a pause before we heard anything from the superintendent, and you reached out. Do you want to share a little bit about why you reached out, why that was important to you?
Yeah, sure. So reaching out first and foremost is always because I'm a mom. And I support education of our children, period, whether someone's mom or not. but I happen to be a mom of boys in the public school area. And so I thought it was super important that the education department addressed George Floyd's death, a murder, actually, and all the racial tensions and uprisings that we see now to this day, from community members who have just had enough. And so I just tried to sort of reach her and bring it to her attention and, ask, talking about this. Why aren't the classrooms talking about this? I know at the time when it hit in late May, we were, in a virtual setting, and COVID was hitting some of our families, and distant learning was just sort of starting up here in Waterbury. And so I know there was sort of, what's the emergency at the moment. So I get that. But, the school year ended and there still was no really conversation about what was going on. And I think you do the children a disservice when you don't talk about things that are happening in the community. So yeah, I mean, I appreciate that she had a town hall, which happened, I think, last week, maybe or the week before. Yeah. And so, I did jump on that phone call to voice my same concerns. I just wish that sort of style happened while the kids were part of that conversation. I don't think we heard from one student. I could be wrong, but I don't think we heard from one student in that town hall about how they were feeling, how they were impacted. Have they been to protests? Why, have they seen their teachers, or have they seen their teachers at the protests? that was lost, and a missed opportunity for the city as a whole.
I agree, especially, and I get some people listening might be like, well, why should the school have to reach out and say these things? But I think when you look at your community and how diverse we are, and we have a large minority community, a lot of African American and Latinx, it's important to address these things, especially when the media and things that they are seeing might make them feel as if they're not heard and they're not valued. I think it's important for the school system to really say, hey, we value you, and we are trying to be sensitive of that, no matter what different households are saying in their views, but just to let the kids know that, we see you, especially here when you think of Waterbury, there have been a lot of youth who have participated, and even organized a lot of the protests and rallies. So I agree that to not mention it in the education setting when it has happened, and get their feedback is a missed opportunity for growth, and for advocacy, for kids.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And I also will say that it's a disservice to your white students as well. I mean, you make a better, all around individual when you understand history, true facts, and, the deep issues that are rooted here in America. You as a white person, when you understand and really can history, you are much well-rounded individual, and you will, you'll hopefully, you have a brighter future ahead of you in the sense of understanding and caring and history and knowledge and teaching others. So I think you do it to students, specifically our Black and brown kids, because I think, they need to vent about it, because it's impacting them day to day, also to our white students who need to understand what's going on as well.
I absolutely, because I think it's about empathy. And when you're able to understand the struggles of everybody, whether it's a gender bias, sexuality bias, racial bias, you're able to be like, okay, I understand why you might have taken my words out of context, right? I understand why you were offended at this or that. It's not necessarily about changing one's views or changing anything, but it's about saying, I understand. And I think that's important, is to have that conversation so that everyone feels that they're being respected.
Absolutely. One important thing, I'll jump right into is a request I was making of the superintendent was to offer anti-racist education, in the classroom, and, especially professional development. But, I think that that's the only true path that folks can take to really address racism in this country, is to be anti. And what does that mean? It means to fight against racism, consciously and and making equitable choices on a daily, in a daily way, and taking those actions to end racial inequities, not just in this scenario, but any and every time that you can. I think that's what it means to be anti-racist. So how do we bring that into the classroom for teachers and for students? I think addressing self-awareness is key for teachers. Asking tough questions, that many of us don't want to address, even if you're in the class. Specifically for the classroom, like, how am I perpetuating racist ideas in my classroom? Who are the kids that I'm labeling, or who are the ones that I'm punishing the most? Who receives praise often? And do all my students, do I have all or high expectations of all my students? And really, I mean, there's a bunch of other questions, but just starting there and answering them honestly and truthfully to yourself, I think many of us will be uncomfortable with our answers, right? And that's okay.
Absolutely.
That's being self-aware and saying, okay, there is a problem here, and now I need to take action to address it. Because once I do, we can talk about systemic racism in the classroom.
Absolutely.
And it will have a positive impact, not only on myself as the teacher, but also on. So, I encourage and I challenge educators to really get uncomfortable with themselves around this issue and become more self-aware.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because I was talking about that in an earlier episode with Margaret, and self-awareness is important, and that's the only way that we're going to have growth. And I think it starts with the teachers, because it's as simple as you put it. Who's getting more praise? Who are you? The expectations you have, and like you might not intentionally be doing that, but like
Right.
you slow down and be like, okay, why do I have different expectations? You might find that there's a little bit of bias. You
Right.
might find that it's actually based on what the student is able to do. But I don't think that there's anything wrong in being self-aware, because that helps to make sure that you're removing bias.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's the only way. Once you become self-aware, you really can stop and think about what's getting in the way, what are causing the issues in my classroom. You can really. So another thing that I encourage teachers to do is to talk about race. Let's stop ignoring it.
Why do we do that? Why do we ignore race as if it's like a bad word? Like, why do we do that?
I think because it's comfortable to ignore it, and it becomes uncomfortable when we don't ignore it. Which is why it's so important to address issues first. But as a society, we've ignored racial inequalities for so long, and it's hard to address this. And the same for the classroom. I'll say that it's interesting that during 2 months of the school year, Black History Month and Hispanic Heritage is predominantly the only time students are really talking about Black and Brown history during those 2 months. But what's on the rest of the school months, And so I encourage and challenge teachers to really look at resources and ways they can incorporate Black and Brown history and other things, art, for instance, like incorporate that throughout the year. Brown artists. Let's talk about Black and Brown composers and music. Let's talk about music's history and rap. It's just incredible history and knowledge, that we can show support of the Black community in so many ways. During those 2 months specifically, many times Brown heroes. MLK and Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, Frida Kahlo, Cesar Chavez, and I love all of them dearly. I think they all made really great contributions to our society, but there's so many others that continue to not be named. There's so many other incidents in history that are not brought to our children's attention. That again, you're doing a disservice to our Black and Brown community students, white students.
Absolutely.
The George Floyd incident. I mean, we didn't talk about that in schools at all. Like we sort of started the conversation. I asked my son, who's in 4th grade, every day since it happened, hey, did your teacher mention it? Have you done it? Because him and we have these conversations at home.
It's important. It's important.
It's important. So, those are challenges I give to educators to really start addressing in the classroom, and hearing from their students, because they need to vent about local and national news that are, really affecting them at home. And
absolutely. And I think, again, for people listening, they might be like, well, why does the teacher have to do that? I would say, think about it in the same as gun violence. These are things that are affecting our kids, and oftentimes it's easier for them to talk in the classroom amongst their peers and with the teacher versus at home. And sometimes at home, again, we don't think to have these conversations. So I think that in the school, and they can send out something saying like, hey, like these are topics that we are going to talk about things that are going on because they directly affect the students. You might be wondering, well, why is the student acting up? Why is he angry? Why is this happening? Why are they withdrawing? well, let's talk about what's going on in their world and how are they affected by it, because they are listening.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I couldn't agree with you more. I think, the teaching profession is it takes a special person to be a teacher.
It does.
I totally applaud the really good teachers out there. I really do, because it's not for everybody. Clearly, because we have a lot of teachers who really shouldn't be teachers.
Absolutely.
But to all the great teachers out there who are, impacting their students and talking about these things, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
From one mom here in Waterbury who, has biracial children, thank you, because it means a lot. And I just hope that other folks can follow and those sort of attributes and add things like that to their classroom as well. Teachers, I think, they're, well, let me talk about Waterbury real quick. So Waterbury, Dr. Ruffin on the town hall, if she had stats as far as how many teachers live in the city, she didn't have those stats during the town hall, but she did allude to the fact that many of them don't live here in the city. And it resonated with me because it's so important to see your team outside of the classroom. That's when relationships are formed. That's when relationships are built. It's so important for teachers to communicate with leaders and students live. Get to know who are the local heroes, who are the heroes that your student thinks are local heroes. Get to know those folks. Get to know the service organizations that are providing services to the you can be a resource for your students when you see a need, and and you're able to give their mom or dad. I think that's so important to build that relationship outside of the classroom. Show up at a protest. How many teachers showed up at any of these protests? I'd love to know that number. And not just teachers, admins, anyone in the education. Folks showing up in support of our young people who are out here, screaming for help and saying, justice, we demand justice, right?
Absolutely.
So I think that's really important. And reading. Let me stop there with reading. I think it's super crucial. Like, that teachers who don't live in communities that they're live in, or who don't look like their students, that they read up. They seek authors, Black and brown authors, who are talking about education in urban communities. Super important to see the life of somebody, in that community, and understanding education, in that way to that community. Seek those authors out. Dr. Chris Emden is a huge advocate and author. He's a professor at Columbia University. I mean, he's a great one to tap into some of his books that he's done in regards to urban education and what it's like teach in those areas. Chimay Morales James, who co-wrote these of the Black Panthers. I mean, not in Waterbury schools.
And what? To be honest, here in Waterbury, there are a lot of local leaders, local authors. Like, there are people who have poured back into their community, and I do think it's a missed opportunity when you don't utilize their books to reflect within your community. Like, your kids need to see that here we have authors, here we have people who are active in the community. I mean, use them. I mean, and I think it goes back to what you're saying. It's really about utilizing the assets of your community. If you're talking about art and you're in a community that has local artists, well, bring them in. I'm sure they would love to have that collaboration. And while that requires more effort on the teachers or the administration, because it's a collab, I think it's necessary, and it's just going to when we do not acknowledge our community, when we don't acknowledge the resources we have, I just think it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I agree. And it's nice to know that, you know, your neighbor wrote a book. I mean, who knew, you know?
Absolutely.
You know, whether you or not, but I mean, that's pretty cool. I mean, imagine if the author of Harry Potter lived next door to you. I mean, how cool is that, right? So I mean,
they would be at every book signing, every scholastic thing at
exactly. But you know, going back to books, I think it's super important to especially in a community like Waterbury, where Dr. Ruffin has said the minority students are the majority, you know. So then the libraries and the bookshelves look like the students they represent, you know. And in this case, Waterbury, it is Black and brown students. Let's get some of these authors on the. She's awesome. Jason Reynolds, amazing. I mean, these are you know, novels are amazing, you know, and they address they've got characters that look like a majority of our students in Waterbury. Themselves as an author, it looks like some of these, you know, our students in Waterbury. So you to really find and ask whether it's a librarian to order some, or if, you know, again, I know teachers a lot of out-of-pocket expenses that really but you know, if a GoFundMe page, whatever it is, to help get some of these authors inside of your classroom, I think will also help to create those relationships. Oh wow, my teacher thought to have a Black author in, you know, in her room. Very cool, right? So
no, and it's not about, you know, I think a lot of times when we talk about inclusion, people feel like one group is going to be isolated or whatever. And it's not about isolating. You know, Shakespeare is a great author, right? Great playwright. And he really helped to shape other works of art. But you can find other people to help complement that, whether they might be Portuguese playwrights or whoever. But really think about who's in your community and how you can bring the material alive for them by bringing in some of their history and their culture. I think it just helps make it not so boring. You know what I mean?
A good mix. I mean, you know, we see Waterbury as the first town, and it's about you know, the fall and celebration we have, and how wonderful it is to see all these cultures. Well, we need that same mixture in our schools.
Do you think, you know, bringing that up, because at least for me, I don't know, that to me is like the biggest cultural day that we have, and it's not often reflected throughout the year or in different events. But in that cultural event, like we have the school, we have everybody, like we have the bands, and it becomes this whole community thing. Do you think that sets up, because again, this issue of inclusion and diversity, it's one that is often had in the city. Do you think that the cultural parade being so big, such a big event, that it sets up the attitude or the thought that, or the expectation that diversity is also going to be seen in the school system and everywhere else in the city?
Yeah, I'm in some ways it set up a false expectation that the rest of the city is this, you know, or the rest of the systems within this is this, because when you look at the data, it's not, you know, out of 1,600 employed teachers, and I think that includes admins in the school system here in Waterbury, over 1,000 are white females. So, I mean, clearly that, you know, in the education, it's not reflected as far as diversity amongst teachers, administration. I don't have numbers as far as police force and other systems, but I got to believe they're very similar. And the event is beautiful. I go every year. I love the music. I love the food. I love bumping into different folks that I know and folks I do know. It's beautiful in that way. And I hope that, you know,
that is like,
it can be a stepping stone for bigger conversations or bigger changes within the self. Yeah.
I think so. And like bringing it back to the school specifically, another issue that is often talked about is the police presence within schools. And what how do you feel about that? Like just like as a mom, as a city resident, how do you feel about like the police being in the school or being a presence in the school?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, let's talk about the police not being in our schools. I want to have, Liz. but really to set the stage on with some data, Waterbury actually accounts for 3.5 Connecticut's student population, which is pretty small, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, Waterbury students account for 18% of all school-based arrests in Connecticut.
That's a
Now that's
lot.
huge.
That's a
And
lot.
that data, for anyone who wants to go find the data, actually was pulled from a report in February of 2020 from a
Oh,
local
wow.
group, Radical Advocates for Cross-Cultural Education. So they're a local Waterbury group here in town promoting and supporting racial justice and education, and et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so I mean, the data alone indicates that it's a huge problem having police presence in schools for our students who, the students who predominantly arrested are actually Black girls.
Really?
Much higher rates compared to the rest of the country, actually. Yeah. So, the data's there. And during the town hall, Dr. Ruffin, she actually several times stated that the police were numerous times, in the classroom for things that folks should have handled in the classroom and not called the police for. So it's great that she acknowledged that, because I think that's a problem of its own that maybe has to be dealt with or in some other fashion. But it was disheartening at the same time, because there's really no plan in place to make change. How is she really addressing that? Because at the end of the day, even one student enter the school to prison pipeline is too many, in my opinion.
Absolutely, especially
So
when, and no one's saying like, okay, like if it's an emergency and things like that, right? But to hear administration say that things could have been resolved a different way is very disheartening.
yeah, very, very, very. Because
Yeah,
because for and whatever, it's just it's scary, to be quite honest. It's very scary, because for our Black and brown students, again, that just leads to arrest and prison, and that's the cycle, unfortunately, for our Black and brown students. So it's a crisis, in my opinion. I have
absolutely.
just
Mhm.
yeah just I have family in the suburbs, and my nephew, who's in junior high, had a physical altercation in his school. Maybe, I can't remember, and with several other students, physical fight,
Mm-hmm.
and nothing happened. Police were called ever. It wasn't to call the police. It was not even it was folks were sent to then talked to separately, talked to together as a group. Parents came in and spoke to each other and the principal, and it was handled like that.
You know
that
what? Like
doesn't happen in Waterbury.
I know, as you said that, I was thinking about how conditioned we are because how they have it set up. I'm like, oh, the expectation is something happens, you call the police, like that's the law, that's the rule, because that's kind of what's been told to us. The police have to be called. But there was a time that was not in place. So it's it's
Right,
easy to get conditioned to think that this is the norm everywhere, and it's not.
it's really not. It's the norm in big cities like Waterbury with populations, majority minority student. The data proves it. The data's out there. Folks have to find it. It's out there. But I mean, I would love to see police officers out of the school, and the administration using that money towards more mental health support, more counselors, and recruiting more minority teachers. I think those are three areas that are needed in our schools that positively outcomes for all of our students.
And what would you say to people that, because again, kind of like we talked about with the, the fight, and then the police were not called, and, being kind of conditioned that this is
Yeah.
the response that is needed. What would you say to people that are like, well, it's necessary to have the police in the school to keep it safe?
My question, safe for who?
Mm.
Safe for who? I mean, say what that would be my question. Listen, there's no police in Watertown. There's no police in Southbury, Roxbury. The list goes on and on. So who exactly are the school safe from?
I think
is my question when folks bring up that question.
Yeah, and I would be interested to know the response, because I think that often that is either the assumption or things that are heard when people talk about removing the officers from specifically inner city schools.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there is data on if the police in the school makes it any safer or not. But the numbers that you presented as far as who's getting arrested and at the rate is startling. Startling.
And it's scary, especially as a Black or brown parent. It really is. And I think it should be scary even for white folks. I mean,
because the reality is, if it's happening to one group, it can happen to another.
Exactly. Very easily.
Yeah.
And if that's the norm, which it's for quite many years now, then other group at some point, or different groups at some point, or at some level, so let's just nip it in the butt now, and no police in schools. Let's get them out.
And I think it's also important, especially when you think about the climate of everything that these kids are exposed to and what they're seeing as far as police brutality. And I don't think that there's enough discussion on how triggering it can be to see law enforcement in school, where school is often a place where kids feel safe. They feel fed.
Right.
They have, teachers that they connect with. And then to see law enforcement, you might be seeing something that's contrary.
Right.
It can cause that to be a traumatic experience to go to school, rather than just what it's supposed to be about, education and socialization.
Right. I agree 100%. And I actually have a personal story to share. One of my sons was, I said, he goes to public school here, and the school actually threatened another student his age. He's 9, and students of color, my son and the other student that was reprimanded, the student was threatened. His behavior was out of line, whatever that behavior was. I'm not quite sure. And she threatened him by saying, "I'm gonna call the police if this continues." My son is 9. He came home petrified. And that's not okay, because how many other students also heard that same threat, went home petrified, went home scared, went home, didn't eat because they were so home, and actually, instead caused trouble because they were so petrified, right? I mean, that impacts, it probably just didn't impact my son. But it's scary, because that threat alone is something like, to your point, where some children don't feel safe and comfortable around police officers because of the climate, and because of things that have happened in this country that are coming, finally sort of coming to the forefront for people to witness through video cam and things like that. And so, many of our kids hear these stories, or are actually seeing them, and they have absolutely no faith in a police officer being around them as well, as a student of color. And so it's scary,
It is,
Very,
because I think it also goes back to what you were saying about awareness. And I'm sure that that person who made that threat did not mean it to be a threat, but really thought it was a way to de-escalate the situation, right? But
right.
if she would have had awareness of her students, of where she was working, she might have said, okay, I can see how this might be more triggering than helpful. And I think that's why it's just important to have an awareness of who you're working with. Because, you know, maybe in another place, in another time period, that would not have been triggering. But it's important to be aware of the students that you have in your classroom, and their lives, because you
Yeah.
never know how your actions could be triggering them.
Right. I agree 100%, you know, and when we talked earlier about teachers being part of the community, you know, this is also why, you know, because I mean, that admin, if she knew folks who knew the student outside of the classroom, maybe could have made a phone call to, you know, this student's pastor or this student's after school teacher, say, hey, I'm having an issue, can you help me? And they could have spoken on speaker. Those are the things missing when you don't have teachers who live in our communities or interact and engage after school and after school hours. I know that's you know, a lot of work. I get that, you know, but it's
It's the reality.
Comes with the territory.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really does.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So Liz, a question for you.
Yes,
Do you remember your first Black or brown teacher?
I do.
Okay, tell me.
I was at, I believe, Westside Middle School, and he was a male. Was he he wasn't an English teacher. I think he might have been like social studies or whatever. But before that, I'd never seen a male teacher. I had never seen an African American teacher.
Yeah, that's
And
so powerful, right?
you know, it was powerful in the sense that one, I didn't know that they can hold that role, because prior to that, it was white older women that had held that role. And so I'm like, okay, that's the role. And like I had Black role models, I had Black male role models. But in seeing a male teacher who's also passionate about what he did, it was interesting. And also to see how the students responded to him. It was just a different environment. It really was.
Yeah. My experience was freshman year of high school, and just for some context, I actually I'm a product of the suburbs. So, you know, I was the minority as a person of color in the suburbs.
Same, all through elementary school. Yep.
Yeah. So I had that sort of different dynamic, but yeah, it was freshman year in school, and he actually was a substitute teacher that came in because our science teacher was out for the day. And I just remember how the few students of color that day were the first experience for all of us, it seemed, because just of how we interacted and like the pure joy from having this individual in front of us before. And it's just it's an eye-opening, you know, experience for sure. The script really quick. Like I said, I did grow up in the suburbs, and my 5th grade teacher was my absolute favorite. She was the one who actually, of her and her style and everything else, I said, oh, I want to be a teacher one day. And her name was Mrs. Brown, and she's actually a white female, teaching in a white, you know, majority town. But we connected on so many levels, because outside of the classroom, she was my neighbor. I mean, she wrote for me. And so that connection created such a love for this woman. You know, I still remember her face, her name, who her son. She would drive by before. Yeah, we'd bump into each other, you know, outside of the classroom, at the library, store. And so, again, going back to how so important building those outside of the classroom relationships are, whether it's because you live in the you know, the neighborhood community, or you don't, and you make it a point to really invest time in the community that your students are in is so important for our kids.
Question: with knowing she was down the street, did you ever forget like her homework or anything like that?
Oh no, and that's just it. I wanted to be an extra good student because she was awesome and she was my neighbor.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So, and I wasn't a good student to begin with. I've always been like a C.
Yeah.
So, you know, in my eyes, that wasn't a really good student academic wise. But so, you know, that year was probably my best year as far as academic participation, everything, because the classroom relationship we had and her as just a human being. I mean, she was kind, she was generous, she was funny, you know, and then that outside dynamic was so cool. So cool for
you know, now that you bring that up, I have to say any teacher that like I thoroughly enjoyed their class, they were teachers that valued that relationship, that student teacher relationship, and that made you feel comfortable. Like you knew their classroom was a safe space.
Yes.
I don't think that there's enough conversation about the value of the relationship, whether they're Black, white, Asian, whatever. That relationship is important.
Absolutely.
But I also think, you know, it was nice to go from the suburbs to the city and see a more diverse. I saw male teachers. I saw male teachers that might have been Albanian or Italian, female teachers that were Italian. And just seeing the diversity, it was just nice. It was like real life.
Yeah. I hear you. It's nice when you can, you know, see folks who look like you, see folks who don't look like you, and know their history and cultures, and then relate to folks who do look like you, and you can relate on so many levels as well because of what you share, you know. Super important for our kids all around, Black, white, Asian, Hispanic, Latinx, you know. It's such a powerful and impactful opportunity for our kids that unfortunately in Water have really seen that diverse you know, sort of mixture like some other folks or some other towns have. So we have work to do, Liz. You know, there's lots of work.
There's always work to do. Always work to do. Always work to do. But one thing I really hope that administration does, especially while we're on this break from COVID and we're getting ready to go back in the fall, is look at what other districts are doing, look what other states are doing as far as diversity. There was this one online plan that for the school, it's an online school, and they were talking about diversity, and they talked about changing the design of the curriculum to have courses that included systemic racism and that explained the history and legacy of slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, and their impact on Black Americans in the past, in the future, and even current wise. And I think that's important to, like you said in the beginning, to have continued conversation. So that way even students can realize and be like, oh wow, I didn't know I was affected this way. Or you know what I mean? It's just important to continue this conversation and to be sensitive of those who are in your classroom.
Absolutely. That's a must. That's a priority.
Absolutely.
There was recent legislation about to pass Black history as a mandate or actually just added to curriculum, right?
Yes.
And I don't think it's mandated. It's more of it's an elective in high school. Now you can to take the class, which I applaud and I think is really awesome. I just hate that it's not mandated. You know, I think it's so important for something like that to be mandated at all students.
Absolutely. The language was very vague and like how it's incorporated. Like if I remember how the law is written, it's like one place can incorporate it as just say a semester, one can incorporate it a year. Like it was just very vague and how it gets to be administered.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate.
It is an opportunity, you know, but I mean we'll see. Hopefully the kids that do partake will really think out of it and teach others. You know, I mean that's the goal. Not repeat history, but teach it Absolutely. Well, so we don't repeat it, you know, and Absolutely. Make those same mistakes.
Absolutely. Like in my opinion, though, this is just me. I would have rather had more of an inclusionary method or stance. Like, I would love for it to be like, if we're going to talk about history and we're going to talk about like mathematics and talk about Einstein, who are the other mathematicians that were Hispanic or whoever? Like, let's be more inclusionary versus an elective. But I do think it's progress. But I would like to see it grow from there.
It's time. It's just time.
Absolutely. And I think that starts with putting the kids first and what's going to be helpful for them. And that, I don't think it's like a one size fits all. I think that depends on wherever you are, wherever you're listening. I think that involves parents, talking to your kids and asking them, like, what do you want? What is helpful for you? And really helping your kids have a voice, and you also being their voice with the administration and with the school system. Because they're listening to these issues, they're seeing these issues on social media. So I think to ignore them is an injustice for them, and it leaves them with questions that they want answered, and we can only answer them by talking to them. And so I challenge anyone that's listening to definitely ask your kids, what do they think about their school system? What do they think about what they're learning? And see where that conversation goes. And if your kid, like your school system is satisfying all that, then that's great. That's awesome. Help another neighboring community get there.
Right. Absolutely.
Maybeth, any last words before we bring this to a close?
I just thank you for having me today. Anytime I get to chat with you and dive into deep conversations. Yeah. And, I hope that folks can take this opportunity to really learn, really look within at your own, struggles and issues that are not allowing you to see injustices that, I'm going to be real specific, that Black and brown folks have been facing for centuries. And, I really just challenge you to do that without feeling attacked. And just know it's for the betterment of everybody, period. So I look forward to working ways. I look forward to working with other parents who, have sort of the same values and beliefs that you've heard today from me. And, really just engaging with the community and other systems on true change for the city.
It's important. The school should reflect the community. There are some communities that their faith-based is super important. Then that should reflect in the school. Like this, the school is so important to these kids. It's where they spend the most part of their day. I don't know what COVID maybe not, but life after COVID.
COVID is a whole other issue. Woo,
girl.
You're going to need a whole other segment for that.
Oh my gosh. But I really, those who are listening, I challenge you, get involved in your school system, get involved in your community, because that's what's really going to help these kids. But Maybeth, thank you so much for being a guest. Before we disconnect, I have one last question for you. And it's the what's in your cup question. And so this part of the show, I like to ask people, what are 3 things that you're going to put in your cup to get through the day? And so for myself, I'm going to put in, I think, tranquility. I want some peace, some easy, breezy kind of vibes for the rest of this afternoon. I think intentionality. I want to be intentional as we move forward into making a better society for our kids. And I just want just ease. I think ease.
Yeah.
So ease, tranquility, and intentionality. What would you put in your cup to get you through today?
All right. So in my cup, I'm going to put some patience.
Ooh.
Yeah, because I need some of that. It's hot. The hotter you are, the less patience you have.
As
it
a
is
kid,
hot
you was
today.
always going to get a beating, and when it was hot, you sit down. Just sit down.
You know it, yes. Some self-care,
Mm,
some alone time today.
yes.
But then I also, the last thing, I need some family time. I
Mm.
owe it to my kids today. I've been busy actually on my computer screen working several hours. So I definitely mommy time. And so I'm going to give that to them in a little while.
Awesome. 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 So those of you listening, I challenge you to think about what are 3 things you need in your cup to get you through today and every day, because it is important, especially as we battle and we take down systemic racism, COVID, and everything else that 2020 is throwing our way.
Right.
So Maybeth, you take care of yourself. Listeners, you take care of yourself.
Thank you, Liz. You too.
All right. Bye.
Bye.